everyone, and thank you for joining us for another segment of AppSec Decoded. My name is Laurie Carr, the blog managing editor, and I am here today with
Tim Mackey. I'm Principal Security Strategist at the Synopsys Cybersecurity Research Center.
So when we refer to technology suppliers, we mean organizations that supply products and services for other organizations or for the public. What can the technology suppliers do today to prepare for any future changes as a result of the executive order?
So there are a couple of things to be thinking about. So the first is how you communicate security incidents to your basically customer base. So if you are a supplier of cloud services or as a service type offerings, you're going to have your consumers, and they're going to be dependent upon the security practices that you are employing, whatever they might be, from the deployment side all the way back through to the development side. If your security practices are having some gap in some fashion, well, it's actually in the best interest of your customers to know what the testing paradigms that you've used are, such that they can have appropriate mitigations and compensating controls in place. So that type of transparency is going to be crucial. Knowing where your code is coming from, that might be a requirement that is placed on you by the federal government if you want to transact with them. Having log information that is something that can be understood by those who are operating your software, also something that is called out within the executive order. But one of the things that is most important is understanding that authentication is a key component. So not just having a simple password, but having multi-factor authentication in place, having authorization controls at the network layer, things like a zero trust infrastructure where the services only know how to talk to each other, that the humans are authenticated with the specific tasks that they're going to be performed, and there's authorization for those tasks for a specific interval or window of opportunity. So you start to get into a scenario where the deployment paradigms, the operations paradigms, all of the development paradigms around this have a level of transparency that says you must only allow the minimum configuration necessary to perform the task, not the reverse where I'm going to make certain that it always works and kind of deal with the consequences.
So when we refer to technology buyers, we are referring to organizations that buy materials, products, and services from various third parties. What can technology buyers do today to prepare for any future changes as a result of the executive order?
So the big things that the buyer should really be focusing on is how their supply chain communicates security information. So if you think of a world where the supplier, they've gone and tested their software to whatever standards make sense to them. They're now providing it to you. Maybe that's package form. That's now something that's going to be deployed on-prem to you. The reality is, unless you know how they've tested their software and what threats they've mitigated and what they've kind of deferred to the future, you're to a certain extent kind of looking at this through a blind lens, and you're going to need to figure out for yourself how things work. That's one of the premises behind black box testing, for example. With the executive order and the transparency and communication of information that is kind of part and parcel to a lot of the elements that are present in the EO, you end up with a greater potential to understand what the supplier was doing and then evolve your threat models accordingly. So you're now in a position to understand that, or you're potentially in a position to understand that the security testing was primarily focused on proprietary code, not necessarily upstream open source governance. And so now as a result of that, you can say, this is something that I also want to implement in my organization, an understanding of the open source used within this deliverable that I've gotten, this artifact that I've received from a supplier, and kind of do the right things. Where the right things might be updating your threat models. It might mean going and performing monitoring of open source activities so that you know when there's new security disclosures. It might mean deploying it in a different configuration where you've applied a much narrower set of rights between services in your, say, Kubernetes cluster or in your cloud. whatever the deployment paradigm is can now be informed because of the transparency that you now have to what your suppliers were doing.